Hi, everybody. Welcome again to another episode of the ShopNotes Podcast. I'm your host, Phil Huber. I'm joined by Logan, as always, but this time with a special guest. We got the trifecta of woodworking managing editors here, executive editors, editors-in-chief, all that, with Mike Pekovich. So you want to stay tuned for this episode as the brain trust meets, I guess. This episode of the ShopNotes Podcast is brought to you by Harvey Woodworking. When good enough isn't good enough, see all of our new tools at harveywoodworking.com. All right. This is also episode number 227, so I was just going to shout out a little respect for Marla Gibbs on her TV show 227 way back in the 1980s.
I would say you're going to make a reference that I don't get, and you nailed it.
Yep. It was the latter portion of the 1900s when TV was big.
Yeah, the late 1900s.
Yeah. All right, Mike, welcome to the show and welcome to Des Moines. We actually had a couple of nice days for you this week.
Yeah, it's great being here. Thanks for having me, both in Iowa and also on the podcast.
Yeah. The reason you're in Iowa is we had you on an episode of the TV show, so that'll be season 19 airing later this fall. So you people can mark that on their calendars for when that starts to come out. We could put a photo of your project. You want to just talk a little bit about the project that you did?
Yeah, so we made a little tea chest. It's a really cool project. It's something that I had made a while back just for myself, but I started teaching this as a project in the last year or so. So that's when I actually got my act together and got plans made and all that good kind of stuff. It's a really cool project because there's a lot of stuff going on in a small package, which I like. So you're not hoisting lumber around, doing a lot of prep, but there's enough there to keep you busy at your bench for a while. And it's a really cool thing once you're done.
Yeah. The scale of it, I like in the sense that the corners of the case are dovetailed, but as we were talking about, it's not like 16 dovetails per corner. It's 3, 4. So It feels like it's manageable to do. Yes.
And then the rest of the stuff is pretty much handled by machines if you want to, mainly the table saw. And what's a little bit novel about it, it's got a chest, it's got some wrapped handles on the side, and the lid actually consists of 2 frame and panels which are hinged in the middle. So it just sits in a rabbet. You open the lid by kind of folding it back, and inside there are a pair of miter trays that lift out. So there's a lot of cool interaction. You take this thing to the table after dinner, have some tea, pull out the little trays, let your guests rifle through your tea packets, and it's a much nicer experience than just bringing out the cardboard boxes.
Right. I feel so judged right now. Well, you know what I like about the lid that you did is you're using dominoes to put that frame and panel together.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, it's funny because I think all of us get those comments where it's like, oh, why are you using dominoes? But it's like, it's easy and it works perfectly for this. You know what I mean? Like yeah, you could do little tenons, but why?
Yeah, exactly. On a piece like this, so it's smaller pieces. The option I might normally do on a small door like this would just be like kind of stub tenon joinery on the table saw. You run a full length groove in there. The thing about this is there's no like panel that needs to fit into a groove. It's just a Kumiko panel, which is press fit, which meant no grooves, no stub tenon. What's the next option? Domino, get a nice little 5mm domino in there, fits really well. The cool thing about the domino, if you haven't done this before and you have one, clamp it down to some sort of a base, and you really turn it into a stationary tool, similar to putting a handheld router in a router table. It completely transforms it in terms of what it can do. And then once the domino is locked down, then you can clamp your small parts to that work surface with a hold down clamp, and you can work really accurately and safely with little parts, because I wouldn't want to be holding this little part in place with one hand and dominoing with the other. That's just scary stuff. So so it's like, the whole thing about dominoes, it's like anything else. It's like, oh, why would you have one? It's not whether you have one or not, but if you have one, how can you put it to use to make it work for the things that you're making?
Yeah. And point taken on putting it into a table like that, because I think a lot of people, when you think domino, I mean, we're conditioned by all the photos that go with it, and it's on much larger work pieces where you take the tool to the piece of wood and doing the joinery. So if you hold up the pieces for this frame and then hold up the domino in your other hand, you're like, nope, just not gonna. And it's the same way with a router table. You're exactly right. If you hold a handheld router table in one hand and a small little piece that you want to put a round over on all four sides, nope. But you flip that into a router table. Yeah, I'd do that all day.
Yeah, and full disclosure, I didn't make this concept up. This I picked up from years back. Michael Fortune wrote an article for Fine Woodworking on using a biscuit joiner, which is, one of those most demeaned woodworking machines around. And of course, he's like a brilliant maker, brilliant designer. And I learned from him, he screws his biscuit joiner down to a base and again, basically uses it as a stationary tool. So I did that for years, and I just took that concept and said, if it works for a biscuit joiner, it works for a domino, and really, really smart concept.
Oh, and it's funny because I think some manufacturers have jumped on that as well, because you can now buy commercial bases for the domino.
Oh, okay.
To do the same type of thing, kind of the flat pack style. I think Veritas has one. A few of them have them.
Cool.
Now. It turns it into that little joinery machine that's just set up somewhere in your shop, and you just zip your parts.
Yeah. In my first hold down for the domino, the table, I make these sort of kind of elevated, I call them bench horses or bench risers. Basically, it's two sheets of plywood with some sort of upright in between them, so you can clamp the bottom layer to the bench and clamp whatever you want to the upper thing. And I use those for tons of stuff. I just happened to have one which was maybe 12 or 14 inches deep by about 48 inches long. And so I just kind of screwed my domino to the corner of that to get it to work, and it worked really well. So then when I was traveling and teaching, I was bringing this big, giant, 4-foot long table with me, because that's just, and then I think I was flying somewhere, and I said, this is too big to pack. And it's like, oh, wait a minute, this thing only needs to be about 8 inches by 12 inches long. And it's like, okay, let me make one a little bit smaller.
Bag.
Yeah. So the one that made on the TV show is a domino plate holder Mach 2, which is much smaller than Mach 1. So
yeah, that's funny.
That was that brings up a question that I had in watching you film this episode. Is I know you do a lot of teaching, and a lot of it, Logan and I have experienced this too. You end up having to, in some ways, teach differently in order to be able to make connections with your students in the class, for being able to, A, get a project done, B, communicate what needs to happen. How much of that then circles around into your own work, where you end up working in the style that you teach?
Yeah, 100%. Yep, you nail it on the head, where the first time you teach, you go in using the techniques that you're just comfortable with in the shop. I remember my first project was a chimney cupboard where there was a face frame attached to the case sides, and you situate it so the face frame is sticking out 32nd of an inch, proud, and then you just flush it with a hand plane. And the owner of the school said, how are you going to do that? I said, oh, just break out a hand plane. We'll knock it out in 5 minutes. He goes, yeah, right. Good luck with that. He goes, you might want to set up, a router with a flush trim bit. I'm going like, why would you do that? That's like so much work. But then when 15 students all broke out hand planes of various vintages and sharpnesses with various levels of skill, it's like, yeah, okay.
Oh.
So you find out really quickly that the methods you use to kind of fumble through a project on your own often doesn't work well in a class setting. So at first it becomes a situation where there's a disconnect. It's like, oh, I do it this way privately, but for a class, I'm going to have to do it this way. But then after a point, you realize that, oh, the method that I chose to help students get through it a little bit more successfully, that's actually the better way to do it. So I would say definitely teaching has made me a much better woodworker, and that now I would say my process is it's one-to-one. There's really no difference between how I would do it in my shop now and how I teach. And if I come up with a way to do it better in class, I ended up doing it that way. I'd say the only thing is, in your own shop, when you're banging stuff out, you might have a little bit more of a shorthand approach to things. So things get done a little bit quicker, but basic processes. Yeah. So I think, I kind of learned how to nail stuff together when I was a kid. The next level was taking furniture making classes in college, where you really learned how to mill lumber 4 square and cut a dovetail joint. And then when I came to find woodworking quite a few years after that, that was the next level, where it's like, let me relearn the craft from all these articles I'm working on every day. And then the next level after that would be once I started teaching about 10 or 12 years ago. I really feel that kicked me into a whole different level of woodworking.
I was thinking Logan did a 2-door little desk boxer that we did that had really small doors on it as well. Mm-hmm. And I remember you, Logan, trying to figure out like what's the best way of teaching that as a class, because it's little pieces, it's power tools. People that aren't familiar with it, there's a certain level of antsiness that goes along with it, and you want people to be successful, but you also don't want them freaked out either.
Yeah. Well, and it's funny, I was literally just thinking about that little mantle box when Mike's talking about, teaching, making you a better woodworker. And that's, absolutely the case. Like, I've in my own shop started to use templates a little bit more. It's like, hey, like instead of just like drawing a line and cutting out of the bandsaw, cleaning up the hand plane, which is what I would usually do. It's like, it does work a little bit better, a little bit cleaner if I use a template for it. And it's like, okay, like I get it. Like it's one of those following do as I say, not as I do type thing. It's like, oh, there's a reason I'm saying this. Like there is a reason involved.
Yes. Yeah, there's a reason you're telling someone to do it in a different way than you would do it. It's like, okay, yeah.
100%.
So, but then in the class situation, I always try to be careful not to turn it into an assembly line activity where the main goal is just for you to end up with something to take home after 5 or 6 days. Because if I take a class, I want to learn something I can apply to my own work. So I try never to use methods, again, that I wouldn't use in my shop or is not appropriate for a person making one of these things in their own shop. That's really key. A lot of times we'll do articles by people who do more semi-production work or teachers who are getting a lot of people through a project, and they say, okay, in order to do this, start by making a template, get your CNC machine and get it all blah, blah, blah. And it's just like, yeah, but if I'm making one of these, this isn't gonna happen. So I'm always, at the magazine, you're sort of vetting techniques based on what the reader is faced with in their own shops, and teaching it's one-to-one. You try to show processes that are super efficient and represent a best practice, because there's no such thing as the best way to do anything, but that you are hopefully conveying techniques that are applicable in a single person shop and things that are going to hopefully guarantee the highest level of success for them once they get going. Yeah. And I know you guys deal with that with every article you guys work on the magazines as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cause I think that's one of the first lessons I learned in teaching. some of the classes for the Des Moines woodworkers is, what's the goal of the class? Is it the thing, or is it what you learned while making the thing?
Yeah.
That ends up going somewhere else. And I think there are some people that are interested in taking a class to make a specific widget.
Yeah.
That they want that in their house. But I've kind of leaned more towards, we might not get the project done over the course of this class, but I want you to know 6 different things that you will apply on your next project and the project after that.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's funny because I have the same discussion with my buddy Jimmy Clues down in Vegas, because he has 5 students every other weekend all year long for turning classes, and his mentality has always been, it's a lot easier for a student to go home with 5 finished projects, because then they can show their spouse, like, look, here's what I spent $800 on.
Yes. Yes.
Which I guess, I get that. But at the same time, it's like, I would, as you said, prefer to take away a skill that makes me a better woodworker rather than a project that was, as you said, an assembly line type thing. And that's always something I've struggled with. It's like, okay, we're in the shop, I have 4 or 5 students, we're working on a project. It's like, how do I avoid having them, standing in line at the table saw that's already set up and all they're doing is pushing their wood through it. It's like, they're not learning a whole lot from that. So,
yeah. And just like in article, you never start any project article by cutting down a tree and taking it into planks. You're always saying, where's the starting point based on what we're trying to convey in the article? Yeah. Same thing as a class. It's like, okay, what are the key points to take away, and what can I do to keep people from, like you said, standing in line, joining and planing or a table saw, when that's not the best use of time in a class situation. And yeah, it's tough. If you're teaching a 5 or 6 day class, people are traveling, putting up some good money to be there. They need to come home with something to show for that. Yeah. I get that. So it's always that balance between, for me, it's like, okay, what is reasonable to make in a shorter period of time versus what do people want to make? And obviously the things they want to make and the time it takes to make, those things don't always coincide with each other. It's like, yeah, you want to do a Maloof rocker in 5 days? Me too. Yeah. So it's that kind of sweet spot of, here's something you can make that hopefully you also want to make. And for me, that always starts, like the articles I write or classes I teach, everything starts with stealing time from my schedule to get in the shop and make something that doesn't have a reason to be made, only because I want to make it. So I figure if I start with something I like, it doesn't matter if it doesn't fly and no one else likes it. That's okay. But on the other hand, I can't really expect anyone else to get excited by a project that I'm not first excited about. So I think that's, it's like you don't want to kind of teach to a lowest common denominator, this, sort of same thing with articles in the magazine. You want to, we never, like as a staff, we kind of vet proposals. And what I'm looking for is, I don't care if 5 people say, yeah, that's okay, we could run it. It's like, that's not great. But if one person is like, I love this, we have to do this, and the other 4 people are like, this is terrible, I'll listen to that one person who's like super excited by it, because that means maybe 1 in 5 of our readers are going to be super excited too, as opposed to 5 out of 5 like, meh, okay, so same thing for classes and teaching and projects, and that goes for just the things that you make in your own shop. Is I just taught a design class this last weekend, and the whole point was to try to encourage people to come up with as many ideas as possible before you decide on one to make. Because if you want to get out in the shop and you have a spare weekend and want to make something, and you sort of formulate an idea of what you want to make on your way out to the shop and get going, a lot of times halfway through that project, you're like, is this worth my time and effort and lumber? What am I doing here? So it's that thing is trying to get to the point where you're super excited to make something. And ideally, you want to be to the point where there are too many things you really want to make that, that you actually have time for. That's good, because then you're choosing between things you really like to the one you most like. And I think, always our time, our materials, especially if we're doing this full time, it's such a tough go to make time to get out in the shop. And once we're there, we want to come away with something we're proud of, we're happy about. And it really comes down to, deciding on something that you really want to be making. And that's why I think magazines, we're a really good source for that. Phil, at Woodsmith, I think you're like the consummate project magazine, because I think, we talked about, yesterday we were talking about Woodsmith, and I said, Woodsmith is the gutter bumpers at the bowling alley that keep you from rolling a gutter ball with a project you make. It's like you follow a Woodsmith plan, you're going to knock some pins down and people are going to be pretty happy with what you're making, and you're going to be happy with that too. So talk about that, Phil, in terms of kind of your mission at the magazine and what you're hoping to offer your readers.
Well, I think, it really is easy to think of the 45 plus years of Woodsmith and just think of it as all the projects and the plans. And on one hand, you can easily say, hey, how many bookcases does a person need, or end tables or something like that? But that's almost beside the point, because how many different houses or people are there? And we all have different tastes and interests and whatever. And then from a woodworking perspective, what I want to do in those projects is, in the same way that we were talking about with classes, is I'm kind of using the projects as bait to teach you something else, whether it's case joinery with dados and a handheld router, or this time it's going to be dovetails, or another time it's going to be, a big lesson in mortise and tenon joinery, making a Roycroft inspired piece, which I kind of have on my schedule to write about here. So there's that element of it. The other element, like you said, is confidence, that if I'm going to pick a plan that I see in the magazine or from our plan site, that I have a high level of confidence knowing that by the time I'm done, it's going to look very similar to the pictures, to the photos, that we have those drawings in there that give you all those things. And I think with that base level of confidence, then I also want people to feel like, now I can kind of riff on this, because I already know that the joinery is sound. The design looks really cool. So if I need to make this buffet like a couple of inches wider, like, it's still going to work. If I want to make this dresser out of oak instead of cherry, I know what I can do to do that, and it's going to be the same. So I still want that baseline in there. And then, what we want to do moving forward is draw some connections to people, that folk are building projects, and what can Woodsmith do that supports those project builders in terms of techniques that you would learn, or an alternate technique. I don't have a mortising machine to make mortises. Well, here's a article and a video on using a Forstner bit in your drill press, and in 2 minutes you have a pretty clean mortise that has rounded ends, and then you could leave them rounded, or here's how to square them up with a chisel, that kind of stuff. So it's that kind of stuff. That's the thing that excites me, is being able to make some of those connections to support a project builder.
Right. Yeah, I mean, you have the distinct advantage of pretty much building things. Everything is made by a group of really experienced makers, so the practices are going to be very sound. And you're talking about your concern is, well, maybe we're a little bit too narrow in terms of the techniques we can recommend. And on the other hand, it's like at Fine Woodworking, because everything is written by an outside author. In the extreme sense, what's better, to have someone show you a way to cut a dovetail, which is really sound, or 75 ways to cut a dovetail, and you get to choose which one you want to use. So it's kind of the problem with Fine Woodworking is the joke is you can go onto our website, search our archives, and find a million ways to cut a dovetail, but you're still not really left with a smart way forward if you have to kind of choose sight unseen. So a lot of my task is, we've got so much content, and of course it's all great stuff, but I think what I'm trying to do is try to curate some of that content to kind of say, look, if you're starting out, start here, and we can kind of give you a path through this and sort of kind of wade through all this is here. Not that some stuff is better than others, but I think one thing that gets lost is, if you are learning how to cut a tenon from one maker, if you're learning how to lay out a joint from another maker, you end up with bits and pieces where every single one of these makers are super successful because they have an overall process where every single technique lives within sort of a universe. And I think that's what gets lost if you're kind of picking up and at random choosing this technique or this technique. And that's why I try to, in my classes, I really, really stress the point that none of what I'm teaching is the only way or necessarily the best way, but within a method of working, all of these parts and pieces line up to create what I hope is a really efficient way to be making furniture.
This episode of the ShopNotes Podcast is brought to you by Harvey Woodworking. When good enough isn't good enough, see all of our new tools at harveywoodworking.com. Yeah, because I think when I look back at the way I build a project in my home shop, I can pick out, if I think about it, different aspects that I've gathered from other makers or magazine articles or people that I work with here. But you can't start by cutting and pasting all of that together. You kind of have to have like a baseline skill of, I'm doing mortise and tenon this way. And then once I have that sound, now it's like, oh, the way, Mark in the shop lays out a tenon makes total sense. And I can see how to apply that to my own practice, rather than, like you said, just kind of gooping a bunch of stuff together and stumbling along.
Yeah. Is that your cat there, Logan?
That's Goose. He's trying to stand on the keyboard, which is really annoying. So I'm like holding him hostage. I'm not in like the towel wrap stage where I have to like wrap him in a towel to keep him from moving, but he's currently just being pet. So
yes, that's cool. Yeah, we have a few Zoom call cats that make their appearances in our staff meetings. Yeah, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, Chris, it seems like they only start being really active during a call. Like there's somehow some frequency sent out by Microsoft Teams or Zoom that activate some kind of signal in all the cats.
Yeah, or it's this sense that this person is actively paying attention to something other than me. So.
Now, maybe connecting a dot between the T-chest and your design class, Mike, that you were talking about, is I think one of the things that I've seen as lessons is using material thickness as a design element.
Oh, yeah.
In the sense that there's a lot of get started in woodworking sort of books out there that have you using available materials from home center or lumber yard. And so a lot of stuff is just built out of 3/4 inch thick material.
Sure.
and suffers for it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's true. It's the curse of the, bookcase made from 3/4 inch stock, to where the sides are going to look undersized for the scale of it out of 3/4, and the shelves can look super clunky if they don't need to be that thick. And I mean, that's a tough place to start out. So if that's where you're starting and you don't have a means to mill lumber, yeah, start with 3/4 stock, of course. Yeah, and you'll make what you make. And then, so later you're going to get to the point where you're going to have the ability to work with stock in different dimensions, whether it's ripping at the bandsaw or planing parts thinner at the planer. God forbid you break out a saw and be ripping your parts and resawing your parts with a handsaw. I don't know. There are people who do this, but
there are sociopaths in this world.
Shame on them for recommending other people do that. No, of course, there's anything, everything can be made in woodworking, can be made with hand tools, because it was done that way for hundreds of years. So yeah, you don't need a saw stop, although they're nice. You don't need a planer or bandsaw. However, yeah, so short of, okay, I can't do anything about working with 3/4 inch thick stock. It's cool. That's okay. You can make an edge look wider by putting a little face frame on it. So you get a 2-inch, you get your 1x2 and glue it to the front edge of your 3/4 stock for the size of your bookcase. And now, okay, that's cool, but I'm still left with 3/4 inch thick stock for shelves, and it looks kind of clunky. Fine, buy yourself a block plane and chamfer a really heavy bevel on that bottom corner of that front. Now all of a sudden the visual part of that front edge is now 1/2 inch or 3/8 of an inch instead of 3/4. So we can play with sort of that visual aspect of, let's vary the thickness of the parts to fit the scale of the piece. But I think the main thing is, once you become aware of it, you can't unsee it anymore. But I think that having someone point out the thing you made, and hopefully in a kind way, it's that's really cool. Wouldn't it be cool if those sides were a little bit thicker and the shelf was a little bit thinner? And even if you don't have a way to go about it, as long as you go, I've never thought about the thickness of my stock making a difference. I was visiting John Reed Fox, who's a furniture maker in Massachusetts. Fantastic designer and maker, someone I just idolized. That was a great thing about going on shoots, was getting to meet these people you admire. And of course, I couldn't constrain myself. I had to show him a picture on my iPhone of a piece I had made to get his take on it. And always it's under the guise of, hey, I made this, I'm pretty happy with it. Something's missing. What do you think? Can I get your opinion on it? And it was this piece where it's kind of slab sides and top, and of course dovetails. And it's something, and I added some kind of oversized tusk tenons to the bottom shelf just because I felt it needed something. So I was sort of expecting him to tell me those were too big or too small or whatever. And he looked at it and goes, the grain of the drawer stretcher is pretty squirrely. And I'm like, what do you mean? It's everything is nice, quiet grain, but this one piece of wood separating a door in a drawer, which, hey, was quarter sawn stock, but because it was flipped on its side, the front edge was plain sawn. He goes, I would rather have had straighter, quieter grain, right here. And it's just that would never have even occurred to me to look at in a million years. But once he pointed that out, that's all I see in everything I make, and even worse on everything that I have made in the past. It's oh. So yeah, I think it's that awareness is going to grow over time the more you make. And just one thing I really stress in design classes is you make something cool. Take 5 minutes, be your own harshest critic. Look at it with a very critical eye. And even though you spent 6 months making this thing and you're never going to remake it to fix anything, allow yourself some time to say, I would have changed this, I would have changed this, I would have changed this, and then turn it off. and call it good, because good job.
Right.
You made it. It does what it needs to do. Don't be mentioning these things to other people. But unless you make something and really assess it with a clear eye, you can't get better and move forward, because all the things that bother you about this piece, they're going to inform the next piece you make. And that's how you get better over time. So it's this combination of take a hard look at what you're doing and then give yourself a break and then move on. And you can make 10 pieces and not necessarily progress as a woodworker or designer if you're not giving each one thought. But if you just do your best, take a look, and then do your best the next time around, that's how you kind of get to the point where you're making things you're really, really happy with.
Yeah, I like that idea, because one of the things that's a little frustrating for me as a woodworker in my home shop, following some folk online, is they're making a lot of the same thing. Mm-hmm. Whether it's, chairs or bowls or spoons, and they kind of have a thing, and you can see an iterative development over time. Yeah. I'd like to make one of those. I don't know that I'm going to make 12, so
yes,
trying to find ways to iterate on something, knowing that the next piece is not even going to be that.
Yeah, that's a good thing. I know some people, really good designers, who said, man, if I made anything that looked the same as the last thing I made, that would drive me crazy. I want to do something completely original with everything I make. And I get that. And other people, unfortunately, I put myself in the category of, I tend to want to make the same piece over and over and over, like for some reason. And like you said, one way to move forward is to stay in the same place. Another way to move forward is make sure you're taking a big leap with everything you make. And I think each one is good. I think kind of staying at the same place, like with the multi-iterations, you run the risk of maybe not really pushing yourself from a design concept, but it does give you a means to really hone in and dial in the details of what you're making to get to something good. Where I think if you're jumping to really original ideas and you get to, say, 80 or 90% of successful, and then you jump to a new thing and get to 80 or 90% of successful, are you ever hitting the mark of where you're trying to go? I don't know. Michael Fortune, again, huge influence. He said, if you're always hit the target, maybe you're standing too close. Meaning, like, if you're hitting exactly what you're trying to, maybe you're not presenting enough of a challenge for you. So it's like, okay, sure. That too, yeah. And if you know Michael's work, he's probably one of the most brilliant contemporary designers. His stuff is like, you look at it, it's beautiful, and you say, how in the world did that even get made? So, yeah, I don't think there's one right answer. You just got to kind of figure out what fits you, what suits you. I do think that staying in the same place or working only from published plans for fear of messing up, for fear that, well, if I really try to do it myself, it's not going to turn out good, that's not good. I do think that, we're making stuff out of nothing. Like, we're starting from scratch. We may as well make it the way we want it to make it. And often we get constrained by this notion of making something that looks real. Like, wow, Mike, that looks like you could buy it in a store. And it's like, no, and on one hand, you cringe. On the other hand, it's like validation, right? Oh, you made something that looked real. So I think, wow, that is something maybe we kind of hold as a bar. Like, hey, I do want to make sure I'm making real furniture. At the same time, if we constrain ourselves by trying to make something that looks normal, we kind of rule out making something that looks abnormal, but in a really cool way. I would much rather, even though I advocate against too much contrast and mixing too many woods in a piece, if someone sends in, a piece to our readers gallery and it's got like 17 tropical hardwoods in a bathroom vanity, it's like, hey man, more power to you, because that's you. That's where you're at. And I think I would much rather see that than something which feels like a direct copy of something in a Pottery Barn catalog that quote unquote looks correct. Not that, I love traditional shaker stuff. I love super clean, but at the same time, man, fly that flag, whatever, whatever makes sense. Learn the rules and don't be afraid to break them. If that's just kind of what you're called to be doing, that's okay too.
Now, later on this year, Mike, you and I just found out that our England tour got confirmed.
Nice.
Yeah. So the best of news and the worst of news sometimes, because it's like, it sounds really cool. And then it's like, all right, now I got a plan for this. So what are some of the things that you're looking forward to about this? Because I know last year we were trying to do this as a first event and weren't able to generate enough interest on it. But now this time we know that we're going to have people with it.
Yeah. How about that? So, yes. I mean, I've only been to England and Europe once, and that was with a family of 4 in tow, which is wonderful. I love my family, every single one of them, and traveling with them is great. However, I'm kind of looking forward to going without the time constraint of the attention span of an 8-year-old, sort of deciding, how much time I can sit here and look at this, medieval Gothic pierced carving on this piece of furniture. So I have a feeling, I think the biggest thing is that we can kind of geek out with other woodworkers who are as passionate about the things no one else cares about as we are. So I think that's kind of wonderful. And also, you and I are going to be there, but thank goodness. Well, I mean, I don't know about you. You're more cultured than I am, but thank goodness I'm not the one leading these tours and saying, look at this. There's like a full-on professional tour people who are like pointing out the good stuff to us, and we're just along for the ride. So yeah, I think it's going to be a blast. I know that we've hit sort of the minimum in order to get the trip to go, but as far as I know, there's a number of openings still there if folks want to sign up and tag along. So
yeah, we would love to make this a filled out trip. Yeah, we have a minimum of 15. We're there. We can do a maximum of 30. So there's room, but not a lot of room. So if this is something you've been interested in thinking about, but also want to make sure that it's actually going to happen, it's happening.
Yeah. So even a full trip is still going to be pretty much a one-on-one experience, I think. So
yeah.
So I'm excited about that. And thanks very much for the folks who signed up before it was even like a guaranteed done deal. Thanks for taking the faith and putting your name on there and getting us to that minimum. Because it was kind of like super excited to go, but because it didn't go last year, we're kind of thinking the longer it went until it filled up, maybe it won't go. Maybe I'll have it.
Yeah.
And then the first time they said it's a go, you go, oh no, we're going. I have to get my passport and all that stuff. And that lasted for about 5 minutes until now I'm like super excited about it and looking forward to going.
Yeah. Yeah, I've been rechecking out the links on our itinerary on the different places and looking up some more of the things. And, one of the first days we're going to be hitting the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, which is just going to be a drink from the fire hose sort of a situation where there's just going to be so much to see and look at. And then we get to narrow down and tour some old houses and some schools. And Logan, you had the idea for one of the tour stops was the boxwood plantation.
Yeah, I was waiting for an opening to say, having put a lot of effort into planning this and not going, I'm going to be pissed if somebody doesn't bring me a piece of boxwood.
All right.
So yeah, there's So a gentleman by the name of Hugh Crompton works at the Wormsley Estate. I don't know if he's the curator, but it is like a 300-year-old boxwood plantation that is constantly being managed and harvested, and Hugh sells boxwood blanks for woodwind instruments, for tool makers and stuff like that. So, I've bought some boxwood, but I bought like the, back alley boxwood that's all cracked and spalted. I haven't got any good blanks until you guys return with suitcases full for me.
There we go. Yep.
But then the next day, actually, so I think that's on one of the days, and then either the next day or the following day, there's the Weston Arboretum, which will be really cool because that has a huge collection of, as a tree nerd, that has a huge collection of different species, and these trees have been, they're hundreds of years old, and that will be a really cool one as well.
Very cool. Yeah, Logan, you were pretty instrumental in kind of figuring out the itinerary last year, and from our staff, I was already kind of had something going, and we were going to have Anissa tag along. So it wasn't until we kind of saw the latest itinerary from the tour agency or whatever that I kind of got to see it. So tell me more about what's in store for us on this trip.
So as Phil mentioned, the Victoria and Albert Museum was one that was kind of like it's like one of those like must go to type things. So what we found when we were planning this, we were trying to find things that would interest us as woodworkers, and there are modern furniture makers in London, but they're kind of factory type settings for the most part. You know what I mean? So it's a lot of, going through and there's CNCs cutting out stuff. It's like, well, we don't want to see that. We want to see the history. We want to see where a lot of our, American design has its roots, so there is the London School of Furniture. I think that is. I should probably pull up the. The itinerary to make sure I'm not talking about anything incorrect. But I'm pretty sure there's London School of Furniture Making, and there's a museum that I think it's maybe the Museum of the Home, Victoria and Albert Museum, and then there is some free time I think on that day for people to explore London. So if you find some boot sales, that would be fun. There is a day of going through the Triton office, so visiting the Triton tool manufacturer. And I think they may even probably should check this, but I'm pretty sure that they are sending everybody home with a tool.
Yeah.
So that'll be cool as well. And then there is, I don't think they're associated with Triton, but there is a giant. Think of it like a Woodcraft or a Rockler, but it's called Yandles. Yeah. And it's right down the road from Triton, so there will be time spent there as well. I know they have a huge lumberyard, which will be really cool. Would not be upset if somebody brought me some pear wood as well. So just throwing that out there to you two that are going. There are a couple other museums. I talked about the Arboretum already. I think there is either the day of the Arboretum. I think there may be a manor house and estate that is getting traveled. I don't know if it's on the same property as the Arboretum or if it's right down the road, but there is a manor that day. There is an art gallery that has some kind of contemporary furniture and stuff like that. Cool. One of the days, as well as the Gordon Russell Museum. I think that hit a lot of them. There are a couple really well-known furniture builders in London. And we reached out to several of them, and they were all super interested in having groups through. But the general consensus was that their shops are very small. Like, getting 30 people into somebody's shop would be very difficult in some of these. Reached out to, I think, Richard Arnold and Dave Barron and, a couple of people there. So it'll be a fun trip.
Yeah.
I'm not upset you two are going because It's going to be exhausting, but it will be a fun trip.
Yeah, I'm definitely looking forward to it. For me personally, I think, like you said, anything where you can kind of take a step back and look at the things that modern makers were inspired by. I think that's really cool. And just me personally, just with a huge fan of the arts and crafts movement, I know the English arts and crafts movement was a really big influence on the American side as well. Yeah. So curious to see anything along those lines as well.
The Rod Martin Manor, which is that's the same name as the Arboretum. That's an arts and crafts estate. So
awesome. Okay.
The entire thing is an arts and crafts estate. So that'll be
perfect.
Really, really cool.
Okay.
So, and there are another thing I did not mention is there are several days where there are group dinners and group, maybe a group breakfast, stuff like that. So, cool. You are with Phil, Mike, and the entire group, but then you will have free time by yourself as well. But then it's like, hey, if you guys want, come back here. We'll have dinner at, the Cheltenham with everybody, wherever. Cool. So,
yeah.
It'll be wild. Some days I'm really excited about it, and some days I feel overwhelmed by, there's going to be, we have things that we're going to hit, but it's like, there would be so much else to be able to see and do. And I'm kind of one of those guys that when you're watching a movie or a show on TV, looking at the stuff in the background. So
yes.
I'm sure going through all of these houses, there's going to be all kinds of the stuff in the background kind of things that are just going to be very fascinating to me. And I'll probably end up having to spend a lot of the evening deleting photos off of my camera and off my phone just to make room for the next days.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The days are, the travel and stuff like that is on a tour bus. So, travel's provided, you're basically, you get there and we'll take it from there. Or Mike and Phil will take it from there. I will not. So, and our hope and our goal, and I think, Phil, we've talked about this in past episodes when we were doing this last year. Our hope and goal is to do this yearly, not in the same spot every time. So the initial plan was to do the England trip last year, and then Mike and I were going to go to Japan this year on a trip.
Yes.
That may be next year's trip at this point. So our plan is to fill these out. Obviously we've hit the minimum, but we have up to 30 spots available, and then, kind of go different areas in the world that have a rich history of woodworking or have contributed to the woodworking, space in some way.
Yeah. Very cool. So, and then for those of you in the Northeast who don't quite have the budget to head to England for a week to look at woodworking, May 9th and 10th, we're running our Fine Woodworking New England weekend event at Connecticut Valley School of Woodworking in Manchester, Connecticut. Basically, it's just that last year it was free. This year it's almost free. I think it's like $25 a day entrance. That's just because we have a lot of demonstrators and we want to take care of them. But antique tools, food trucks, a number of vendors, both large and small, just jam-packed with demonstrators and on a couple different stages and at various workbenches throughout the weekend. So just show up, have some fun. That's really cool. And then you guys are doing something in the fall once again in this neck of the woods with the Woodworking in America. You guys have got that pretty much underway as well.
Yeah, we're nailing down some speakers for that, presenters, trying to get all that taken care of, trying to be a little bit bigger, kind of like along the lines with Fine Woodworking in New England, just a little bigger and better to make it a richer experience for people. Yeah. Because I think yours last year was a really big success for where you were starting with. Same thing with ours, with Woodworking in America. And it's like, what's our next step on each of those?
Yeah, in the past, kind of pre-COVID, we'd done sort of a similar style event to what you're doing, where it was more of a weekend retreat, smaller group of people, a little bit more intense. And this time, just sort of reintroducing ourselves to live events once again. I just wanted to do something kind of as much out of just saying thanks to everyone hanging in there for so long. So that was just a free show up, have a blast event. And then we had all kind of touched bases earlier at the Handwork show in Iowa. That was the first time I was there. And I was really inspired by that event. Again, you just kind of show up and there's so much going on that was something I sort of wanted to emulate in a very small way in New England, just to kind of provide that type of event. So two very different types of shows, and I think they're both. You should go to both. Don't try to decide between Fine Woodworking New England and Woodworking America. I really think, or England. I think you need to be doing all three if you really want to be fully rounded with your woodworking events.
Yep, exactly. All right, I think that wraps up another episode of the ShopNotes Podcast. If you have any questions, comments, or smart remarks, I want to hear about them. You can send them in an email, woodsmith@woodsmith.com, or leave them in the comment section on our YouTube channel. They're the sugary drink that keeps this whole thing running. So we usually have a good amount of comments that we can share from episode to episode, and we'll jump back in with that next week. Thanks, Mike, for joining us.
Hey, thanks, guys.
We'll see you next time on the ShopNotes Podcast. Bye, everybody.